The year 2025 did not begin with an explosion. It began with a silence. Budgets froze, programs stalled, websites went dark, and quietly, the global humanitarian system slipped into something it had never experienced before, a recession. Not a recession of need, a recession of help. In Geneva, officials warned that the world was on fire. In New York, leaders called it a moral indictment. But in practice, the fire hoses were shrinking, then disappearing. By the end of the year, more people were hungry. Fewer were fed, and the gap between suffering and response had never been wider. This is not a story about one country cutting aid. It is a story about what happens when an entire system realizes it was built on assumptions that no longer hold. If this matters to you, if you believe global crises don't stop at borders, stay with me. Because what broke in 2025 didn't break loudly. It broke structurally. And to understand how, we need to step back and name the problem clearly. What failed in 2025 was not compassion. It was capacity. The humanitarian system is often described as a safety net. In reality, it is closer to a balance sheet. Every year, governments and institutions make a calculation. Who needs help, where they are, how much it will cost, and whether the political will exists to pay the bill. By late 2024, that calculation no longer worked. Needs were rising, not falling. Conflicts were unresolved. Climate shocks were accelerating. Attacks on aid workers were becoming routine. And yet, the money began to retreat. What made this moment different was concentration. Nearly 40% of global humanitarian funding came from a single country. When that pillar weakened, the entire structure wobbled. This was not just a funding gap. It was a systemic exposure. A model built on emergency generosity was colliding with an era of austerity, nationalism, and fatigue. To see why the collapse was almost inevitable, we have to understand how the humanitarian system evolved and why it became so fragile in the first place. For most of the past decade, the humanitarian system survived by scaling up. When crises multiplied, appeals grew larger. When costs rose, donors paid more. It was not efficient, but it worked until it didn't. Between 2019 and 2022, global emergencies stacked on top of each other. A pandemic, a major land war in Europe, new conflicts layered onto old ones. Humanitarian appeals nearly doubled in cost. Governments responded with record funding. Cash flowed faster than reform. That success planted a quiet vulnerability. The system adapted to abundance, not restraint. Programs expanded, staff numbers grew, logistics assumed continuity, but the structure never diversified its financial base. A small group of wealthy states carried most of the burden, and one country carried nearly half of it. When political priorities shifted, the math stopped working overnight. By 2023 and 2024, the warning signs were already visible. Budgets tightened, pledges shrank, emergency became permanent, but funding did not. What followed in 2025 was not a sudden shock. It was a delayed reckoning. A system designed for escalation was forced into contraction, and it had no playbook for retreat. That set the stage for the first real break. The break came faster than anyone expected. Within days of the new administration taking office, the assumptions holding the system together collapsed. First, a pause, then a review, then stop work orders. Aid programs that had taken years to build were frozen in hours. Field offices didn't receive explanations. Partners didn't receive timelines. Websites went dark before contingency plans could exist. What made this moment explosive was not just the scale of the cuts. It was the speed. The largest humanitarian donor in the world did not slowly step back. It vanished. Programs feeding millions were told to halt mid-cycle. Health interventions stopped between shipments. Staff were laid off before they could hand over responsibilities. And there was no substitute waiting in the wings. Private sector funding was supposed to soften the blow. It barely showed up. Governments that had already cut their own aid budgets watched closely and followed suit. The signal was unmistakable. If this pillar could fall, none was secure. If you're wondering how a system meant to save lives could unravel so quickly, you're asking the right question. Because this wasn't chaos, it was a predictable chain reaction. And the most dangerous part wasn't the funding freeze itself. It was what it exposed underneath. Beneath the headlines about cuts and freezes was a deeper mechanism at work. Humanitarian aid is not a stockpile. It is a flow. Food moves only if contracts are signed. Medicine arrives only if supply chains stay intact. Protection exists only if trained people are in place, every day. When funding stops, nothing pauses gracefully. Everything breaks at once. Agencies were forced into impossible choices: feed fewer people or feed the most desperate and abandon the rest. Budgets shrank, but needs did not. So the system began triage at a global scale. This is where the moral weight shifted. Aid was no longer about prevention. It became about rationing survival. To preserve dwindling resources, agencies cut food from the hungry to save the starving, not because it was right, because it was the only option left. At the same time, staff losses hollowed out institutional memory. Experienced workers left. Local partnerships frayed, coordination weakened. What looked like a funding problem revealed itself as something more dangerous. A system optimized for emergency growth had no architecture for controlled decline. And once that decline began, it fed on itself. The next rupture would not be financial. It would be human. The human costs surfaced with brutal clarity. Hunger surged, not in theory, but in bodies. Children lost weight before statistics could catch up. Families skipped meals long before famine was declared. By 2024, acute food insecurity had already reached record levels. In 2025, it crossed a line. Aid agencies recorded something unprecedented. 2 famines declared in a single year. First this century. This was no longer about future risk. It was about present damage. Cuts rippled outward. Refugee rations were halved. Health programs shut down mid-treatment. Communities that had survived war now faced starvation in peacetime. And while civilians suffered, another group paid an even steeper price. Aid workers, in just the first half of 2025, more humanitarian workers were killed than in any full year before 2023. Not caught in crossfire, not by accident. Increasingly, they were targeted. And for the first time, the data showed something deeply destabilizing. State actors, the very entities meant to uphold humanitarian law, were now responsible for a growing share of those deaths. In places like Gaza, the consequences were stark. Humanitarian access itself became lethal. When helping the vulnerable becomes a death sentence, the system reaches a breaking point. And that breaking point doesn't stay abstract. It lands hardest of all on people like you, far from the headlines, but trapped inside the consequences. Now, bring this closer. Imagine your food budget being cut in half overnight, not because you earned less, but because someone far away changed a policy. Imagine standing in line knowing the ration will not last the month, knowing your children will eat less tomorrow than they did today. This is not abstract suffering. This is daily arithmetic. In places like refugee camps and conflict zones, aid cuts translated into numbers people could feel. $6 a month for food, not per day, per month. When nutrition disappears, the damage is not temporary. Children's brains do not catch up. Bodies do not simply reset. Growth is stunted. Cognition is impaired. A lifetime is quietly altered. And here is the hardest truth. None of this happened because solutions don't exist. It happened because attention moved on. If you've ever wondered whether global decisions affect individual lives, this is your answer. They do immediately. If this story makes you uncomfortable, it should, because discomfort is often the last signal before indifference sets in. And once indifference takes hold, suffering accelerates. The consequences don't stop with those who are hungry today. They spill outward across borders, markets, and politics, shaping a far more unstable world tomorrow. What happens in one camp never stays in one camp. When humanitarian aid contracts, instability expands. Not dramatically at first, incrementally. Food shortages don't just create hunger. They create movement. Desperation pushes people across borders that are already tense, already closed, already armed. Aid cuts ripple through regions. Host countries absorb pressure they did not plan for. Local economies strain. Social cohesion erodes. At the geopolitical level, the effects are quieter but more dangerous. When humanitarian access collapses, diplomatic leverage weakens. When aid workers are targeted, international law loses credibility. When states become the primary threat to relief efforts, the rules-based order frays. This is how humanitarian failure becomes strategic risk. Conflicts grow harder to contain. Radicalization finds fertile ground. Regional crises metastasize into global ones. The paradox is cruel. The world spends less to save lives, and far more later to manage chaos. 2025 did not just reduce aid flows. It weakened one of the few tools the international system has to prevent crises from cascading, and once that dam cracks, the question is no longer whether consequences will spread. It's how far. To answer that, we have to look forward and confront the futures now unfolding in front of us. Looking ahead, the future splits into three paths. The first is recovery. A political shock reverses course. Funding returns, not to past abundance, but to functional sufficiency. Agencies stabilize. Access improves. The system survives, scarred but intact. This is the optimistic path. And right now, it is the least likely. The second path is normalization of decline. Aid budgets remain low. Crises are managed, not solved. Triage becomes permanent policy. Some lives are quietly deprioritized because resources demand it. The system continues, but with a smaller moral horizon. The third path is collapse. State actors continue to target aid workers. Humanitarian law becomes optional. Access disappears in the hardest places. Private funding never fills the gap. In this future, humanitarian aid stops being global. It becomes selective, political, transactional, and once that line is crossed, it is almost impossible to return. These are not abstract scenarios. They are already forming. What happens next depends on whether the world treats 2025 as a warning or as a precedent, because systems don't fail all at once. They fail when the unacceptable becomes normal. And that brings us to the final question. What do we do with that knowledge now? What happened in 2025 was not a temporary shortfall. It was a revelation. It showed us what the world looks like when solidarity is optional, when life-saving aid depends on political mood, when the systems built to protect the vulnerable are thinner than we believed. The worst humanitarian year on record was not defined only by hunger or death. It was defined by choice. Choices to pause, to cut, to look away, and once made, those choices reshaped millions of lives that will never fully recover. If this story feels distant, it won't stay that way, because hunger does not respect borders. Instability does not remain local, and systems that fail quietly tend to fail everywhere. The question is no longer whether the humanitarian model needs to change. It's whether the world is willing to act before collapse becomes permanent. If you believe understanding power, policy, and consequence matters, stay engaged. Share this story. Question the assumptions behind aid fatigue, because the next crisis is already forming. And what we learned in 2025 is this: when help becomes conditional, survival becomes political. And that is a world none of us can afford.